All right, so what we're going to talk about today is kind of finish up with bone growth and then start taking a look at kind of some of the reasons that you might remodel bone, either due to stresses or damage to the bones. So really one of the last things to talk about here is to take a look at the epiphyseal plate and what's going on here. And this is basically describing how bones lengthen. So one of the analogies I always kind of use with this is the epiphyseal plate is a lot, and formation of bone is a lot like building roads is the analogy I always use. Most of the time when they're building roads, they don't just cut down all the trees and come in with an asphalt truck and lay down pavement. They'll come in there and they'll grade it a little bit, flatten it all out, put down different types of gravel before they'll actually go and pave the road. And that's a lot like what is going on here with the epiphyseal plate and cartilage. The cartilage is there actually kind of being like the grading crew, and then the paving crew is those osteoblasts coming along and finishing it off. And if we were to look at this actual epiphyseal plate, you can see that there's distinct layers where there's stuff going on in each of these ones. And again, once that epiphyseal plate is gone, you're done growing. So just like with the road, once the paving crew catches up with the grading crew, the road is done for the day. Uh, so what we have going on here in the epiphyseal plate, closest to the end of the bone, you're going to have this area of resting cartilage. So this is just hyaline cartilage that's not actually dividing or doing much of anything at all. Helps hold the rest of the plate to the epiphysis of the bone. Next down the line here is going to be an area of proliferating cartilage. So this is where this cartilage is actually growing, and you'll actually see these columns of cells all in rows, and this is going kind of parallel with the shaft of the bone. So this is, again, lengthening out that cartilage, so there's going to be more cartilage to turn into bone. As we get a little bit down there further, you get these oversized cartilage cells. These are ones that aren't dividing any longer. The walls of the lacunae become really thin, and these are really oversized cartilage cells. Behind that, or beneath that, is going to be about 2 to 3 layers of cells that are calcified. So these are minerals being deposited into the space between the lacunae, and this is killing off those chondrocytes, which allows the fifth zone, which is a zone of ossification, to break down the walls in between these columns and actually get bone cells in there and capillaries into these areas to deposit this matrix and continue to lengthen that bone out. So you can kind of see the differences right here. So the resting cartilage, you can see these columns of proliferating cartilage. You can see where the cells start getting bigger and bigger. And you can see here where now that they've died off and are calcified, and now we have those bone progenitor cells, those osteoblasts, converting that cartilage, that calcified cartilage, to bone and moving the bone further up towards the epiphysis. So the length really is that zone 2 to zone 3, where you're getting these much larger ones here that push more and more cartilage and that towards the epiphysis, which keeps the bone getting a little bit longer. As long as this hyaline cartilage is continually being replaced and continues to grow, the bone can continue to get longer. Sooner or later, what happens is that hyaline cartilage is completely replaced by bone, and at that point, that growth plate has finished its growth, or that epiphyseal plate has finished its growth. So again, through childhood, the paving and grading crews, so the making of cartilage and the converting it to bone, kind of goes at about the same rate. Both of them not particularly fast. So we maintain the thickness of that epiphyseal plate. As you get older, cartilage production is going to slow down, and we start to see a little bit more osteoblastic activity. When we get into puberty, both these things ramp up, but it does ramp up those osteoblasts much quicker than it does the cartilage production, and because of that, by the end of puberty, you are going to get rid of that interstitial plate and cease to have interstitial growth. The only way to really have a bone lengthen after that is would be required to break the bone and then kind of keep stretching it apart as it starts to try to work its way back together to keep lengthening that bone. What's left of that epiphyseal plate is just going to be a little line that you can see on an x-ray. And this is just kind of showing that idea right here. You're laying down new cartilage here, converting it to bone here. As long as we maintain this thickness, you can keep getting taller. Once it seals, you're done. And that is that epiphyseal line that you can see here and here on this image. Bones also are going to grow in an appositional fashion. A lot of times this might be to get strengthened or increase the weight support of that bone. If you've ever been around PVC pipe, little pipes that are hollow, don't have a lot of structure to them, are a little bit bendy. As you get a bigger and bigger diameter, it tends to be stronger and stronger. It's going to be kind of true with bone as well. You can have about the same amount of bone, but if you put it into a bigger diameter area, a lot of times will strengthen that bone. So what they're going to do is you can take bone away from the inside of the bone and put it on the outside of the bone. So by reabsorption and deposition of bone, we can make these bones narrower or wider depending on what the body is needing. And this is one of the things that happens, obviously, as you get older, those much smaller bones tend to get bigger and wider across. And this is how we're doing that, by reabsorbing bone on the interior of the medullary cavity and depositing bone on the outside of the bone underneath that periosteum. And you can kind of see the idea right here. Obviously, we're laying down more bone as we go through this, but you can see, sorry, my mouse is a little touchy. You can see on this one here how we've taken bone out of the interior here, deposited it on the outside, and as you continue to do this, you can get a larger diameter bone. And again, this is part of that bone remodeling, goes through childhood all the way through adulthood, where we have certain parts of our bones that are being replaced every 4 to 6 months, like it says there. Certain parts of that femur, like the diastasis of the femur, not going to be replaced even during a whole lifetime. But areas that are getting more damage to them or more stress on them are probably going to be remodeled more often. About 20% of our skeleton is reabsorbed and replaced each year. So, and again, this is that combination of those osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts all working together to reabsorb, maintain, and deposit bone. And again, one of the main things that is going to be a cause of this is mechanical stress on the bone. Any weight-bearing stuff or mechanical stress on the bone is needed in order to continue to have that bone remodel. Pretty much the weight of your body, the weight, the gravity on you. These are all things that influence and cause you to maintain bone density. This is also part of the reason if anytime you are, well, not that anybody's been up to the space station, but if you're up to be at the space station for a while, you would have changes in your bone strength more than likely. When somebody is bedridden and they're not doing a lot of support on a lot of body weight support with their bones, bones tend to decrease in density and are more prone to fracture after that. So those are some examples of lack of mechanical stress and what it can do to bone. It can have that atrophy of the bone. And again, it's the weight of your body as well as mechanical force in terms of contraction. So weightlifting and other things like that will also cause mechanical stress on these bones that are going to lead to remodeling of them. And a lot of times, and I mean, to me, I've said this a number of times, but the body has a tendency to adapt to the stresses you put on it. There was a gentleman that came up with this, called it Wolff's Law, and basically says that a bone is going to remodel in response to the forces that are placed on it. And some examples of this: bones are thickest where the bending stress would be the greatest. So if you look at the femur, where is it the thickest? In the very middle of the bone, where it's most likely to bend. Curved bones tend to be thickest where they are most likely to buckle. So those are a few examples there. If you look at a tennis player and somebody that their forehand arm, if they're not hitting a lot of backhands, you would probably see differences in density of that bone and thickness of that bone in the one that is getting more mechanical stress than other. If you look at a weightlifter's bony projections on the surface of the bone where muscles attach, you'd probably have bigger, stronger ones where those people that are doing more weightlifting, for example, would have that. So basically, again, though, the body is going to adapt to the stresses you put upon it. And this is true of the bones as well. And again, more weight-bearing activities will increase bone mass throughout life. When you don't have that mechanical stress, you get less bone mass, reduced collagen formation, which are all things that can make people more prone to fractures as they age. And again, like I said, if you were to look at a power lifter from 15 years of lifting weights, you would probably notice the differences in their bones versus somebody who hasn't done that. As well as if you're in space for an extended period of time, this is one of the issues with long-term space travel, is because there is not as much forces being put on those bones. You have to come up with ways to get mechanical stress on those bones to maintain your bone density and your bone health. So really the last thing I want to talk in this one, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of some of the main homeostatic mechanisms in the last show of the bone chapter, at least of the lecture stuff. I just want to talk about fractures. So fractures are these extreme loads when they're placed on a bone can sometimes cause the bone to break or come apart in certain unusual, a lot of times from unusual or really strong extreme stresses on the bone. Again, the fracture healing is going to depend on a number of things, the biggest being good blood supply to keep nutrients going to that. Anything that limits blood supply there is going to lead to death of that bone because you need blood and oxygen to maintain those cells. So usually what happens on this one, and bone breaks do hurt, and this would be there's lots of nerves in there, it causes a lot of pain, but bone, when you break it, there is going to be bleeding into that area. You get this hematoma, this large swollen area of underneath the periosteum where you've bled into this area. It's going to become inflamed, like I said, quite painful. Certain cells that are really severely damaged might die, but what you're going to have is you're going to have osteoclasts start breaking down some of those damaged portions of the bone, cleaning it up. What is going to happen over the next few weeks here is you're going to get what's called a fibrocartilaginous callus. Capillaries are going to grow into this area after the phagocyte, those white blood cells have cleaned it up a little bit. They're going to secrete collagen, and it's going to start kind of pasting the two ends of those bones together. A lot of times they talk about needing the bones to knit together. What that knitting is collagen fibers reaching across and spanning that gap. So one of the things you need to do with bones is you need to make sure they are in contact with one another. They can't be spaced apart too far, otherwise it cannot do that. But over a short period of time, you're going to develop this fibrocartilaginous callus. Again, would not be able to support weight at this point, but it is definitely starting to hold those bones together. Over the next few weeks after that, so about 3 to 4 weeks after the injury, after that fibrocartilaginous callus was formed, mechanical stresses being put on this are going to start causing some osteoblasts to start converting that fibrocartilaginous callus into a bony callus. It's going to take 2 to 3 months or longer to get that to be in a much firmer connection, but this is going to start converting what that was fibrous tissue into actual bony tissue. And then really over the next few weeks and months, that is where this is going to continue to remodel the bone, and it's really going to be a lot of times about 3 to 4 months total to get this back to close to a pre-fracture state. There is certain things that they can do to kind of stimulate this a little bit. So there is electromagnetic fields can increase osteoblast activity. So especially with professional athletes who are trying to come back from something a little bit quicker, they may do some of this E-stim stuff to try to actually stimulate that bone to heal quicker. So to me, it's always interesting to also talk about different types of fractures. So you can have what is called a non-displaced or a displaced fracture. Non-displaced fracture just means the bone broke, but it didn't really change from its normal orientation. So the bone is basically still in the same orientation. Nothing's moved at all, but there is a fracture in it. A displaced one, the actual broken part, so this was like, let's say, a bone here, there's a non-displaced fracture would be like this. A displaced fracture would be like this, where they're no longer lined up like they should be. And again, when they talk about a doctor having to set the fracture, what that is usually meaning is they need to put that break back into its normal position. So they need to take, if the fracture was displaced, they need to get it to a non-displaced spot. So sometimes this requires putting traction on that bone and pulling out and reorienting these bones back on one another, none of which is super fun to have done to you. A complete fracture is a break all the way through the bone. Incomplete are these partial fractures that don't go all the way through a bone. You can have linear, ones that are parallel to the way the bone is going, versus transverse, which would be perpendicular to the long axis of the bone. And then you get some of the really crazy ones here where ideally what you want is a If you're going to have a fracture, a simple fracture is usually what you want, and where this is where the bone breaks but doesn't break through the skin. A compound or open fracture is when the bone actually pokes out through the skin. This can be very dangerous because especially the inner marrow cavity of the bone is directly connected to our bloodstream. So any infection that would get inside the bone very quickly is going to get into your bloodstream and can lead to issues of sepsis really quick if not paid attention to and not treated. So especially with compound fractures, you have to be very careful about making sure that everything is cleaned up and antibiotics are given to prevent any type of systemic infection from being very dangerous to these folks. So a comminuted fracture is when the bone breaks into more pieces. A lot of times this is when the bone is a little bit more brittle, so either with age or issues with collagen formation, so osteogenesis imperfecta, like I said, it leads to brittle bones, which would lead to a lot of comminuted fractures. These are usually, like I said, either bone that's more brittle or in some cases very extreme force is being put on that bone. Sometimes when you get in a very bad accident, that force going on the bone doesn't just break it, it shatters it pretty much. Again, to put this back together, you need to get these kind of into these non-displaced flat places. So this is where bone grafting, plates, and other screws like that are going to come into play to help try to put these things back in the right orientation. One of the things I would say about the doctors that work with this stuff, a lot of times we think about surgery being something that would be a delicate procedure. Orthopedics is kind of like carpentry. Their tools look the same. They have saws, they have hammers, they have screws. They don't use nails, but a lot of those tools in that are going to be very similar. I mean, in reality, orthopedics is a very carpentry-like. I mean, I know it seems like I'm kidding around, but it very much is that. It's a lot of using plates and screws and other stuff like that, where if you needed to hook two pieces of boards together, some of the stuff that you would do are similar ideas with bone. A spiral fracture a lot of times comes in sports when you get a foot planted and the body gets twisted around that bone. Sometimes the bone will give way and it'll spiral up there to get you this spiral fracture. Compression fractures a lot of times are crush injuries, so you've fallen from a high height, hit down on your back here, kind of breaks it and does a bunch of these little fractures throughout it, crushes that bone, for example. That would be a compression fracture. Again, more often in these kind of irregular bones that are spongy bone on the interior and don't have maybe quite as much compact bone surrounding all of them. Depressed fracture, it'd be one that's kind of pushed inward. Lots of these really are mainly skull fractures, some type of damage to that skull that kind of puts a dent in. Epiphyseal fractures are also something that really need to be paid attention to. These usually happen on children before the bones are fully calcified. Fracture along that growth plate would be a epiphyseal fracture. There can be, if there's too much damage to that epiphyseal plate, this can cause issues with bone lengthening, and that is something that needs to definitely be watched if somebody was to have a fracture on their epiphyseal plate. Green stick fractures are another interesting one here. When you're younger, there tends to be a little bit more collagen relative to the calcium salts in the bones. So younger children tend to have what I would kind of call more flexible bones. So and if you've ever taken a branch off a tree and tried to break it when it's actually attached to the tree, you know, like a dry branch, you can take it and break it over your leg really easy and it'll just snap. Where like a stick that's just cut off a tree, if you try to break it, it will usually fracture on one side and then hold together on the other. That is what happens in a green stick fracture. You get this more flexible bone that tends to fracture on one side and bend on the other because, like I said, the proportion of collagen to the actual calcium salts is a little bit more organic components relative to the inorganics, which gives a slightly more flexible bone. And you can kind of see in these ones here, this one would be one of those, obviously there's tons of pieces here, a comminuted fracture, or this one here, again, a lot of times that would be a tibia, that is a spiral fracture going up that bone. So what I'll do on this last one here for the bones, before we kind of take a look at some of the bones and the bony landmarks and some of the stuff we're going to deal with that what I would say would normally be more lab related stuff. This is going to be probably a lot bigger chapter for you students. I will talk a little bit about homeostatic mechanisms and blood calcium maintenance and nutritional and hormonal influence on bone growth. And then that'll be the last one that with this type of PowerPoints. So I'll talk to you next time.